The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
So I would like to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Nova Society. I'm Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today we will be discussing the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, responding to listener emails and concerns, what we got wrong, what happened, the appointment that President-elect Trump has made, what may be happening with his New York so-called hush money trial, and more. So we welcome all our listeners back, and we will be here as second Trump administration is inaugurated and 2025 moves forward. So, Mark, Scott, where would you like to begin?
Oh, gosh.
Why don't we, what's going on right now is these appointments. Why don't we talk about that?
Sure. Let's talk about some of the appointments that are being made. The guy from Fox being named as possibly the defense secretary.
All right. So that's the one that's getting the most attention. But I think that the one that really is disturbing is former Governor Huckabee being the ambassador to Israel, because I think that is a clear sign of a sort of direction that the Trump administration is going to take vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians, and that is going to be probably a bit of a game changer for the conflict that's ongoing there and other conflicts in the region.
You're probably right. And of course, Governor Huckabee has some interesting thoughts where it comes to Christianity and its role in the government of the United States. And I really kind of I did see that Huckabee was going to be announced. And I was trying to wrap my head around why him, first of all, why him? There are some other crazy people that could have been put in there, but why Huckabee? Why do we think Huckabee? I mean, you're right. I think it's going to change the direction. It's going to make it a different dynamic. But I'm trying to wrap my head around what kind of dynamic it's going to be.
So, okay. For one thing, I think we have to continue to acknowledge the fact that for evangelicals, especially those in the new Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, which is an offshoot group, like if you can imagine an even more religious right-wing group of Protestant Christian evangelicalism, that's what the NAR is. And I'm not sure that Huckabee is a member of the NAR, but he is definitely one of these, we need all the Jews to move back to Israel so that they can start the end times. And I'm not exactly sure what the justification of it comes from, in the book of Revelations or whatever it is. But it's insane. And, this is the 21st century, and we're talking about apocalypses and people being sucked up in a blue light to heaven, and the battle on the Megiddo plain between good and evil and God and Satan and Jesus, and somehow Trump is gotten inserted in there. I'm sure to his chagrin. He's always willing to run with it if there's something in it for him. And I guess the presidency and all the money he can make from it and staying out of prison is enough for that. And so that's, I think, where we are right now as far as the, that movement is concerned. And it's a payback to the evangelicals. It's a payback to the Huckabee family, which has been very supportive of Trump. But it's also a very important ambassadorship. If you want to pay somebody back, usually you make them the ambassador to Jamaica or someplace like that, some really nice place where nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
So this is not that. And I got to tell you, I'm a strong supporter of Israel, and I want a two-state solution to be the peace, the way that we get to peace. I acknowledge a million times on this podcast that the attack of 10/7 was to stop the deal between the Saudis and the Israelis, a deal which I don't believe Netanyahu really ever wanted, but had to go with because it was just too big to turn down, and that this is a major setback for a two-state solution. It's a major setback for peace in the Middle East. And what I think you're going to find from here on out is a lot of refugees leaving both the West Bank and Gaza, and just and giving up and going to neighboring countries. And in my opinion, they will be destabilizing those countries who do not want them for that reason. And that if anything were to happen to Jordan, which is about 80% Palestinian anyway, another sort of Arab Spring, but in reverse, rather than being more freedom, this would be for a lot less freedom. Those two states, Egypt and Jordan, get destabilized, and the entire Middle East is thrown into panic and chaos.
Yeah.
If I can insert one thing, I believe it was Mike Huckabee, who said that Palestine does not exist, or there is no such country, or there is no Palestine. Very much the same way that Putin said that Ukraine isn't real, and so Mike Huckabee now is going to be the ambassador to Israel.
Yeah.
So and he believes that there is no Palestine.
Right. What Huckabee does is he adopts the language of the right-wing extremists in Israel who call the West Bank Judea and Samaria. Like, one of my friends who's a settler over there calls the West Bank Samaria, and doesn't acknowledge that it's the West Bank of the Jordan River, or that this is a region that's in Lux, or in annexed or not annexed, or occupied territory, however you want to put it. But this is a big part of Israel and needs to be a part of Israel. And that doesn't leave much room for a state there. Now, if you ever looked at a map of what the biblical state of Israel looks like, it includes most of Jordan. And the idea there would be, they gave up Jordan in 1948. They didn't want to, but they did when the UN drew that map. And they carved out that part of the West Bank for the Palestinian people. A lot of Palestinians who were living in what is now Israel were pushed to those areas, never accommodated, never made a part of Jordan, which is, one of the great pities, I think, of all time, but kept in refugee camps to this day. I mean, these refugee camps no longer look like camps; they look like cities, but they are very much in limbo between being a state of their own and a part of a greater, the bigger state of Jordan, and that it's never been a peaceful place. The Israelis occupied it in 1967 after the Six-Day War to trade it back, as they did Sinai and eventually Gaza, I guess. But that was the idea there, was to trade it back for peace and recognition. And they were never able to make that deal, no matter how many times they tried. When Huckabee says that there never was a Palestine, he is correct. There's never been a country called Palestine.
Correct.
But there are people who now identify as Palestinians. When we were growing up, they were simply considered Arabs until about 1974, where the Palestinian movement really became solidified and the PLO acknowledged as the only real spokesperson for the Palestinian people once the Arab League sort of began to give up that fight. So it's a complicated, crazy place that's only going to get more complicated and crazy.
Yeah. And, if you actually really do look at, and Scott is correct, Palestine was never a country. It was actually just considered a region. It has been taken over so many times by so many different, entities throughout history. Canaanites lived there at one point in time, back when Canaanites, before AD, actually. And then, it was taken over by, you had the Philistines took it. And the Babylonians were there, and the Persians. Alexander the Great made a showing in Palestine. So I mean, there's really it's a region, and it's kind of like if you really want to think of it, it's like somebody identifying. Now the three of us are from New York. We identify maybe as New Yorkers, but they're really that's a state. That's not actually a thing, being a New Yorker. You're referring to somebody that is from, who grew up in New York. And in many ways, Palestinians, they are identifying as people that their ancestors at some point in time, they may have been Persians, they may have been Canaanites, they may have been Hittites, they even could have been Israelis, because it's been, as Scott says, it's an area where there's so much conflict that has happened. Let's remember, Palestine sits right in between three continents. There are three continents in which this area, this region of Palestine, exists. And I think because of where it sits between Africa, Asia, and Europe, it's seen this amount of conflict, and people that were there, again, once they were there for a period of time, now they identified as Palestinians, being from the region of Palestine. But to say that's, is that an ethnic group? I guess that's the question we have to ask ourselves: is would we consider that an ethnic group? Hard to tell. Whenever we say the word Arabs. And I think, and I'll even backtrack a little bit on that. When we were in school, one of our colleagues was from Ghana. And one day at dinner, he asked me, he says, listen, Kills, can you explain to me African American? What does that mean? And I said, well, it means that it's an American that identifies from Africa. He goes, you do realize that Africa is a continent. If you were to say that an Egyptian, which is in Africa, is the same as somebody from South Africa, we would get really insulted by that. There's a huge disparity in culture, in mindset. I mean, in all these different areas, that we would be insulted by the idea of African American. You want to say you're a Ghana American? You want to say you're, an Egyptian American, South African American, Zimbabwe American? We can understand that. But he goes, we don't get African American. And I get his point. And I also pointed out to many of the people that identify as African American cannot follow their ancestry back to what exact region in Africa they came from, because they were brought here as slaves. And, that might have been forgotten to time. So that's what makes it a legitimate moniker to say African American. And he kind of got it, but I understood his point. He goes, Africa's a big place, and we're made up of a whole bunch of different peoples that don't look alike in many cases, don't have the same ideologies, don't have the same religions, and it confused him as someone directly from Africa. And I can get that. As far as Mike Huckabee is concerned, my attitude about Mike Huckabee was always this. He, to me, always represented the intersection between Opus Dei and Scientology. He's fervent, and again, that's fine, but he follows in the footsteps of people like Jerry Falwell. He follows in the footsteps of and I'm not even going to say Billy Graham. I don't think he follows in the. Billy Graham was not. Yes, he was a believer. He was fervent. Yes, he was. But Billy Graham was sane in my mind. He was sane, and he just was teaching scripture and the good things of if we live by it, which I get. But Mike Huckabee, I think it's a disaster for the Middle East. We'll see how it plays out, because I agree with Scott in the sense that if there is a mass exodus from Palestine and all these Palestinians start going into these other countries, that has a they're not the stablest places to begin with. They don't start out stable, and it doesn't take much to be the tipping point to make these areas unstable. And I again will agree with Scott in the sense that the Saudi deal is the best deal, and I'm not sure that that's a priority now with this new administration coming in.
Yeah. So one of the other things that Huckabee has said is that there's plenty of room for Palestinians in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and, Syria. And that is, that there is a truth to that, right? If you deny that Palestinians are a distinct people, and here again, where you're going back to your New Yorker analogy, I'm actually from Brooklyn. So I consider myself a Brooklynite, not a New Yorker. But I don't want to split hairs there. The pizza's better, everything is better. But it's not. It's a distinction. It's a distinction that I don't force on people too often. Just to be accurate, we don't. And you're right. We don't often talk about European Americans, even though we acknowledge that. There are plenty of European Americans. We tend to be more specific: Italian American, German American, Polish American, etc. Why we don't do that for the many countries of Africa, I'm not 100% sure. And then I could also say that those lines that are drawn in Africa were pretty arbitrarily drawn by European forces, by powers that didn't take into account tribal loyalties and things like that. So, so that's a reason why there's plenty of messiness in Africa when it comes to peace and getting along. And we've seen that over the years as well. Just the way that the Europeans cut up the world is something that we're still living with almost 2 centuries later, or a century later, depending on where you are. The Palestinian people may not agree with Mike Huckabee that they could go to Egypt and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and be just as happy there as they would be in Nablus or Shechem or some of the other places in the West Bank that they consider home, or Gaza, wherever it is, and all that Bibi can do to make it as uncomfortable as possible is not changing that necessarily. The only solution that there is for what Mike Huckabee is proposing is to basically march every man, woman, and child out of Palestine, out of the West Bank, out of Gaza, at the end of a bayonet, and say, that is now your country is over there, we're staying over here. If that's something that the Israelis with Trump support want to do, I haven't heard a lot of them state it. It is something that I think evangelicals in the United States support more than Israelis do. And I find that a kind of bizarre colonialism, even at this point, that we think we have the right and by we I mean Americans. I'm not one of them, but we do live here in America. That they feel that they have the right to tell people where they can live and where they can't live, rather than try to work out a deal where there's room for everybody. And there is plenty of room, by the way, for everybody there. I mean, I know it looks small on the map, but there's plenty of space available. So it's I would say that is the appointment so far that I think is the most troubling and problematic.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeart Radio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.